So your client is asking you to put together a title card and you're not sure where to begin. Don't worry, I'm here with some tips to help you out. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel because this is video 3 in a 3-part series. And if you missed 1 and 2, well, you wouldn't have if you'd been subscribed. So in this example, we are going to make a title card for the MoGraph meetup, which is a party that School of Motion throws with a lot of other amazing sponsors every year at NAB. And we're going to start by gathering our ingredients. So the ingredients are currently a shot of the Las Vegas sign, the name of the party, the MoGraph meetup, the date and time, the location, and a URL. There's this French cooking term, mise en place. It basically means have all of your ingredients out and ready before you start cooking. And I think that doing this as a designer is really helpful too. Now, I've already gone to Adobe Fonts and chosen the typeface I want to use for this, which is Basic Sans. And if you haven't seen the second video in this series where I go over my process for choosing typefaces and my philosophy about it, I think it'll be really helpful. I chose Basic Sans because while it's a pretty straightforward, clean font, it has some personality to it. And it has many different weights that I can use to help with the hierarchy of the type. But before we start laying out the type, we need a rough composition. When you're not super experienced with design, I think it's always a good idea to use as many cheats and hacks and training wheels as you can. Designing to a grid is a great way to do that because it keeps you from having to guess about where you should put things, how big things should be. You can kind of use the grid as a guide. So I'd like to overlay a grid over this shot so I can start to see the proportions of it and figure out where the type might go. So there's a tool I want to show you. Unfortunately, it is a paid tool, but if you do a lot of design in After Effects, it's totally worth it. It's called Grid Guide. And the way Grid Guide works is you click on one of these options and it creates a shape layer with a grid on it. This is a rule of thirds grid. You can see it's got a 3x3 grid here. And you've probably heard of the rule of thirds already, but there's a lot of other options you have when working with a grid system. Grid Guide is cool because I can just come up here to cells per row and I can change this. So I sometimes like to work with a 7x5 grid. I find that that's kind of a nice proportion. Or you can set this to a 16x9 grid, which will give you a grid of perfect squares that matches up to your composition, assuming it's 16x9. I'm going to set this back to a 3x3 grid, which is just a rule of thirds grid. And it would be really nice if I could snap to these grid lines, but unfortunately I can't because this is just a shape layer. So one of the cool features in Grid Guide is that you can create your grid and then you can say convert grids to guides. Now I can delete that layer and you'll see that I'm left with guides in the exact spot that the Grid Guide put them. And if I'm doing this a lot, I can also go up to View and I can export my guides. And then I can save those guides, re-import them, and use them on other projects. And in fact, I have saved out a whole bunch of different variations of guides that you can use. You can download them for free at schoolofmotion.com. The link is in the description. So for a title design like this, I think it makes sense to have the title over here around the intersection of one of these thirds. And then maybe the sign, which is the other kind of big important thing, can be on the other side. And so just roughly speaking, if I turn all of these type layers on, they'll be over here somewhere around here, and the sign will be over here. Now, it's obvious that the frame is really cluttered right now, but we're going to fix all that. We're going to use some of the tools in After Effects to make everything work exactly the way we want. So I'm going to turn my guides off, and I'm going to start by just taking a look at this piece of footage here. So right off the bat, I'm noticing that the camera is drifting a little bit. I don't really want a camera move on this. I want it to stay still. So what I can do is select the layer, make sure that my tracker panel is open, and if it's not, go up to Window and come down to Tracker and open it up. And I'm just going to click Warp Stabilizer. There's lots of different ways to stabilize things in After Effects, but the Warp Stabilizer is really good at little subtle movements, and it can remove almost all of it without you having to do anything. Once the analyzing stage is done, I can go to Result and change it from Smooth Motion to No Motion. And so now we have a shot that is almost completely still, except we still get all of the nice movement in the lights. The next thing I need to deal with is all of this schmutz in the background, the power lines, and everything else that I don't really want that isn't important. All I want is that Vegas sign, I want the type, I want that type to be easy to read, and all this extra stuff is cluttering up the frame. So here is what we're going to do. We are going to pre-compose this shot because it's stabilized, and if I'm going to be doing anything else to the shot, I want it to be done to the stabilized version of it. So I'm going to hit Shift-Command-C. I'm going to make sure that Move All Attributes into the new composition is checked so that the Warp Stabilizer ends up in the pre-comp. Then I'll just name it Stabilized. Now I'll have to go through the somewhat tedious process of making a mask around the sign, the part I want to keep, and I will not torture you. I will do that, and then we will speed it up. Now you'll notice I'm not being super precise with this, except where the power lines intersect with the sign. And the reason for this is that I'm gonna end up replacing most of the sky. So if there's still some sky showing from the original shot, not a big deal because I'm gonna match it. And this is where I ended up. It didn't take long, just a few minutes. So let me select that mask and I'm gonna temporarily turn it off. And then what I'll do is I'll make a new solid layer with Command Y. I'm gonna call this Sky Replace. I'm gonna move it below the shot, and I'm gonna start by just putting a gradient ramp effect on it, generate gradient ramp. For the start color, I'm gonna grab this blue that's up in the top left corner, and for the end color, I'm gonna grab this color way over here in the side, this kind of orangish bright color here. And so if I turn the footage layer off, you can see that it actually matches pretty decently. And if I turn this layer back on and I activate the mask again, I think at this point you can kind of see what I'm up to. Now you can see where I was kind of sloppy here and it's not matching exactly. So how do we take care of that? So what I'm gonna do is take this stabilize layer and I'm gonna pre-compose this. Make sure that all attributes end up in the new composition and call this masked. Now I can go into that pre-comp layer and I've got my masked off shot that's already been stabilized. And what I'm gonna do now is go piece by piece and just get rid of this blue I don't want. And the way I'm gonna do it is pretty cool, and this is one of the reasons that it's really worth learning After Effects, because there's so many tricks like this that you can use to manipulate your footage and bend it to your will. What I'm gonna do is grab my pen tool, make sure nothing is selected, and just draw a shape over one part of the image. Let's rename this Adjust 01 and turn it into an adjustment layer. Then I'm gonna go up to Effect and I'm gonna grab an effect from the keying section called Color Range. Then I'm gonna grab the eyedropper and select the sky. So you can probably see what we're doing here. We're basically using a keying tool just to get rid of that piece of sky, which is a very specific color. Now this is gonna be a little bit annoying because we're gonna have to do this in a few different places. You're not gonna be able to get all of the blue to go away with one effect. You're gonna have to use a few different copies of it. So that took care of most of it. Now using this fuzziness setting, I can increase it and get rid of the rest of it. And I do want to be careful not to go too far because you can see if I go too far, I start making the video itself transparent. So somewhere around there, it seems to be mostly gone. You can still see a little bit of it, some artifacting there. But if I go check in the master shot, you can see that you don't notice that. And so now I just need to do this a few more times. All right, and we've got something pretty passable. It looks a little weird in this pre-comp, but if we go back into the master comp, you can see that it actually blends in pretty nicely. There's a little bit of extra blue here that is still showing through. I didn't get rid of that, and I could, but also I think that it's not gonna be noticeable once I'm finished with the sky. So why don't I work on that sky a little bit and actually just make the start color match this, and maybe even saturate it a little more. Now that I have total control over it, I can really get exactly the look I'm after. So doing this was a little bit tedious, but now it's awesome because there's so much control. I can take the sign, move it left and right. I can scale it up and down and change the composition and get exactly what I'm after. Now, if I go into the original shot, there was actually some nice design elements that I would like to keep, like the palm tree sticking out of the edge of frame and maybe even this tree down here. Let's go back into the masked pre-comp and I'm gonna make a copy of this shot here. I'm gonna duplicate it, bring it up to the top, and let's name this Left Trees. And let's get rid of the mask. So then what I can do is just draw a new mask on this layer and just get these trees here that I wanna keep. Then I can just do the exact same trick. I'm first gonna change the background color. So I'm going into the composition settings with Command K, and I'm gonna make this a little bit easier to see the edges. So now that there's so much contrast between this yellow and the footage, it'll be a lot easier for me to tell how crisp my mask is getting from the trees. And I can also see that there's a little bit of a problem here. I must have gone a little overboard with one of my masks. It's this one. So I can just pop in here, double click it to open up the points of it, and then fix that. So I'll do the exact same thing. I'm going to apply the color range effect to the trees, pick the sky, and then adjust the fuzziness until that sky is basically gone. Come down here and check at the bottom. And for this one, I might need a separate instance of this. So what I can do is just rename this layer Left Tree Top. I'll duplicate it. I'll call the duplicate Left Tree Bottom. Turn that off for a minute. And then for the Left Tree Top, let me just delete these mask points. Cool, so now I just have that tree. And then on the bottom layer, I can delete these mask points. And now for the bottom tree, I can just adjust the fuzziness and the color and dial that in. Back in my main comp, you can see that I now have these palm trees, and this one needs a little bit of work, but that should be an easy fix. I can just pop in here, I can grab that layer, and I could even just adjust the mask, or I could just increase the fuzziness a little bit more, and that'll probably take care of it. Now we're good to go. Now I also want the tree that was in this bottom right corner, so I'm going to make another duplicate. I'm going to erase the mask, turn the color range effect off for a minute, and then I'll come down here and I'm going to draw a mask. And when we get to the power pole, I'm just going to kind of imagine where the tree would be if that pole wasn't in the way, and then I'll show you what I'm going to do. Now that we've got that masked off, let's turn the color range back on and reset it and try to get rid of the sky. And we did pretty good. So now the main comp is looking like this, and we're pretty close to having a very, very controllable composition now. So again, this is one of the reasons that it is really worth it as an editor to learn After Effects, because you can quickly do stuff like this. And if you're serious, you really do want to learn After Effects, check out our new course, After Effects for Editors. It's taught by Jake Bartlett, one of the best to ever do it, and you are going to learn how to feel comfortable moving around the After Effects interface, how to do some basic visual effects things like this, tracking, cleanup, how to create templates that you can use as an editor. By the end of the course, you're going to feel really, really comfortable in After Effects. You're going to have a whole new superpower, and I promise you, you're going to have a lot of fun doing it. So check out that class. The link is in the description. Now, what can we do about this light pole? This one isn't so noticeable, but this one is. Let's fix it. So what I'm going to do is take this entire pre-comp here, and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to call this tree patch. What I want to do is zoom in down here in this corner, and I want to find a piece of footage that I think I could just kind of cover this up with. So I'm going to grab my pen tool with G, and let's say, I don't know, let's just kind of try this part here. Now that I've masked it out, I can move it over and start to cover up that light pole. If I hit F, I bring up my feather properties, and if I feather that, I don't know, 20 pixels, and then come up here and adjust my mask a little bit so I don't see the edges, there we go. You can see that I've covered it up, and when we're zoomed out and your eye isn't really looking there, it's pretty convincing. I could duplicate this again and call this tree patch 2, and just grab a different part of the tree, maybe more of the top like this. Then bring that patch over here and try to cover up the rest of that. And this patch may work better on top of the first one. I'll add that same 20 pixel feather to it, and it's not half bad. It's not perfect, but your eye probably isn't going to be going there. And if you want to spend more time and really tweak it, you can. But I have this saying, it's good enough for government work. So now let's pull our guides back up. And I want the type to be roughly in this third section here. And so this sign is pretty big. It's going to be kind of in the way. Well, that's not a big deal, because now that I have everything isolated, it's going to be really easy to move the sign. So I'm going to rename this layer really quickly, main footage. Then I'm going to select it, grab my pen tool, and just draw a quick mask around the sign like this. And I don't have to be careful this time because I've gotten rid of all of the extra sky around it. Now, with that layer selected, hit M, and here's my mask. I'm going to set this to subtract, so I'm removing the sign. Then I can duplicate this, rename this layer sign, hit M again, and set it to add, and now I have my sign on a separate layer. I can now move it around, scale it, do whatever I want. And what I want is to have a little bit more room over here for the type. So let's just scoot that sign over a little bit and, maybe line up this crossbar here with this third guide. And now I could even color correct this separately if I wanted, and I have total control over every aspect of this comp. I'm just gonna get a little bit more contrast out of this, mess with the gamma, black input, white input. It's subtle, but I think it's gonna make the footage look a little nicer. And I know that seeing that tiny little bit of pole sticking out annoyed you, so I fixed that as well. So now let's deal with the type. We've got our type, we've got our font, and now we basically just need to size it and space it out. And if you watched video 2, you know exactly how we're gonna do that. So let's first think about hierarchy. I want people to first go and look at the words MoGraph Meetup. And so I need them to contrast in some way with the rest of the type. So we can use font weight, we can use size, and there's other things we can do too. For example, MoGraph Meetup could be set in all caps, and that's pretty easy to do. I can just click this button here, and I don't actually have to type it in. So instead of the regular weight, why don't we try something a little thicker? Let's try bold. And that feels good. I'm curious what black looks like. Let's look at that. And I gotta be honest, I like it. I'm gonna lock all of the footage layers so I don't accidentally move anything. And then I'm gonna turn my guides back on with Command semicolon. I'm also gonna hit apostrophe so I can see title safe and action safe. Now, if you're new to the game, you may not be aware of action safe and title safe because they aren't as important these days as they used to be. On a 16:9 frame, this vertical line here and this vertical line here, these represent title safe, meaning that you generally don't want any text to go outside of those lines. Because on older TVs, the bezel, the edge of the TV, may actually cover up some of the type. And at the very least, they're going to cover up the edge of the frame, and your type's going to be very close to it, uncomfortably close. This outer line is the action safe line, and you basically don't want anything important outside of this line because you may not even see it. Now, of course, most video ends up on the internet now, and so you actually do see every single pixel of that video. It's not as important, but it's just good to keep in mind. So I don't want this type to go very far past the title safe line, and right now it's going a little bit past. I think it's fine. I'm going to turn off those guides, and I'm going to go full screen because this type right now feels a little small to me, but I suspect that if I go full screen, it's going to feel just fine, and it does. So let's look at what point size that is. That is set at 80. So why don't we set the rest of these to 40 as a starting point? And if I kind of scoot them closer together like this so you can sort of see what they look like, and I'll select all of them and kind of find a nice little spot for them. And let's go full screen and look at this. So we've got the sign on this third, we've got the type on this third. The type does feel a little bit small to me. It is really important, and I want to make sure we see it. So let's unlock the sign and let's just shrink it down a little bit. Let's shrink it maybe 10%, move it down to the bottom of the frame and scoot it over even a little bit further. Then we'll relock that layer. I think the composition is still pretty nice, except now I have a whole bunch more room for the type. I could move the type over. Let me turn on my title safe guide here. You can see I can even make this layer bigger now. So let me set the font size up until it hits a little bit past title safe. So now this is at 91. I'm going to set it to 92 just so the math is easy. Then I'll pick the rest of these and set them to half of 92, which is 46. Cool, and that feels pretty good. We can turn these guides off now for a minute. So now we need to space the type out, and if you remember from video 2, we're going to use a common measurement unit. So I'm going to make sure nothing's selected, and I'm going to grab the rectangle tool. I'm going to zoom in and draw a rectangle that is the exact size of the lowercase letters in this typeface. Then I'll zoom back out. I'll hit Y and make sure the layer is selected. I'm going to grab my anchor point tool, hold Command, and snap it to the bottom center of that shape. So this is now our text guide. And I can hit S to bring up the scale property, unconstrain them so I can just affect the vertical height. And I'm going to set this to 300. 300 is usually where I start, and I almost always change it, but it's good to kind of figure out what you like and just start making a habit of doing that. It's going to save you time. So let's move these two type layers down and just focus on this one. I'll select that type layer and I'll select the text guide down here and then use my arrow keys to just nudge it up until it just kisses the bottom of MoGraph Meetup. I can turn text guide off now, and let's zoom out and take a look. All right, so there's a lot of empty space here. It does not need to be this close. And I think this is a good time to talk about the effect of proximity when you're using type. When you have type layers that are really close together, it tends to have the effect of telling the viewer those two things are related somehow, or they should be considered together. But looking at this, we have the title of the party and then we have the date. Those are two very different ideas. So I don't think they need to be so close together. So I can move that down, but on the other hand, the location might make sense to put up there with the date and time because all of this information is sort of information about the event itself. It's kind of the what, when, where. It all kind of goes together. And then the URL could also be separate because that is kind of a separate idea. The URL is a website. It's where you go to get more information and maybe register for the event. So here we're using proximity to tell the viewer, this is one idea, MoGraph Meetup, that's the name of the party. These two things go together and this is separate. So in addition to hierarchy, I want you to also think about proximity. So let's zoom in and let's start spacing these things again. I'm going to turn the text guide on, and instead of 300, why don't I set this to 600? So it's now 6 times the height of a lowercase letter on this type layer. I'm going to drag this down to the bottom of the lowercase letters. Then I'm also going to select that type layer and nudge it up until it's touching MoGraph Meetup. And now that distance feels more appropriate. Because these two type layers here go together, I'm going to turn the text guide on and make it smaller than 600. Why don't we use 300 for that? So I'll bring that down to the bottom of the lowercase letters in this type layer. I'll then select that type layer and the guide and nudge it up. And then because we used 600 for this gap, why don't we also use it for the gap between the URL and the location? So we'll set that back to 600. And maybe this time I'll just zoom in and I'll just nudge the bottom of this type layer, and then I'll move this type layer down like that until the lowercase letters are sitting right at the bottom of the guide. Great, so I think the spacing feels pretty good. Let's check the value structure. So let's go up to layer and add a new adjustment layer. And let's name this BW. and then we'll put effect, color correction, black and white on it. All right, so this is working right now. The type has a value of 100 because it's white, and the sky right next to it has a value of 58. So if you remember from the first video, that's not a ton of contrast. I think we can do better than that. So I want the background to be darker, but here's the thing. I like the color of it, and I really like the way it looks with the sign against that color. So what I'm gonna do is make another adjustment layer here, and I'm gonna zoom out, and I'm gonna draw a mask over the part of the image that I would like to be affected by this adjustment layer, which is really just this part of the image. Then I'm gonna put an effect on that. I'm gonna go Effect, Color Correction, Curves. And I'm gonna bend this curve down, which is gonna have the effect of darkening this part of the image, but also keeping the colors relatively untouched. Now, if I turn off the mask edges here, you can see there's a really hard edge. So I need to come up to this adjustment layer, which I'm gonna call Sky Darkener. And I'm gonna hit F to bring up the mask feather property and feather this until you don't really notice it. Then I can turn my mask edges back on, and I can just kind of play with this interactively to figure out where I want that darkening to begin and end. And I wanna make sure that it's happening underneath the type so that the type is very, very readable. And I could also feather that a bit more. I could go really, really heavy, maybe feather it 300 pixels. And I don't need this part to get darkened, so I can add another mask point here, and I could actually bring some of that lightness back down here in the bottom of the frame. And I'm gonna make sure that this goes underneath the type, not on top of it. Cool, so if I turn that off and on, you can see what a big difference that makes, but if I didn't tell you it was there, it's kind of subtle. Now, I generally try not to leave type perfectly white if it's big and bold because it just feels flat, and I think there's something more you could do with it. So I'd like to add a little hit of color, and I don't want to pick colors randomly. We have this beautiful piece of footage. Why don't I pick the colors from that? So what I'm going to do is zoom in here, and on this type layer, I'm going to add a gradient ramp effect. So that is in Generate, Gradient Ramp. Then I'm gonna scoot over here so I can see more of the footage. Now, I think this dark blue would look really nice kind of at the bottom of the type. So for the start color, the color at the top, I'm gonna pick this blue color in the sky, and then I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna push the brightness almost all the way up and pull the saturation down a little bit more. So this isn't actually white, it's just a very, very bright light blue color. And then for the end color, I could pick something like this. Now I need to adjust the start and end of the ramp. So if I zoom out and I have that effect selected, you'll see these crosshairs, one at the top and one at the bottom, and that is where the gradient begins and ends. And I can grab that and pull it down while holding Shift, and I can adjust where that gradient starts on the type, and I can do the same thing with this bottom layer. And so obviously that doesn't feel very good, that's too much, but we can dial it in the effect itself. So one thing I like to do when I apply gradients to type is use the ramp scatter property. If I crank this up, you'll see what it does. It basically adds a noise over the gradient, and it just adds a little bit more visual interest to it. It also helps prevent banding, which is when gradients separate into their individual colors and you can see bands of solid color. Then I can blend this with the original, and the key is I just want a little hit of color. I don't want too much. Then I can also play with where these crosshairs are. If I want the top color to show up a little bit sooner, sort of towards the middle of the type, I could just pull it down a little bit like that, but I kind of liked it more up at the top like this. That's a very, very subtle little effect, but if I turn that on and off, it just adds a little something to it. And I'm gonna check my value structure with the black and white layer, and I still feel like I'm in good shape. The only thing that is kind of competing with this is these bright neon lights on welcome on the sign. So what I'm gonna do is unlock the sign layer, and on this levels effect, I'm gonna pull the white output down just a little bit. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look at the type while I do it. I'm basically noticing as I look at the type out of my peripheral vision that the neon lights on the sign, those welcome neon lights, they will start to fade from my perception as I dim them a little bit. And as soon as that happens, I'm gonna stop. So I'm looking here, I'm gonna grab the white output and just slowly lower it down until probably right about there. So I didn't do it very much, but I think that made a big difference. If I set this back to where it was and then back to where I just put it, you can see it did dim it a little bit, and it does make the type pop more. So let me turn that adjustment layer off, and you'll notice that you don't really miss the extra contrast that was in that image. Looking at the value structure again, I also want to kind of tone back this information here because now that I have a gradient over MoGraph Meetup, I feel like these are kind of competing for attention because they're so bright. So what I can do is just grab those three type layers, and I'm gonna grab this blue color, then I'm gonna select it, And I'm gonna push the brightness up somewhere in the 80s like this, and then desaturate them quite a bit so we don't get so much blue. And I'm gonna play with the brightness until they feel like they recede a little bit into the background as opposed to MoGraph Meetup. And so here is our value structure check now. I'm liking it. I kind of want MoGraph Meetup to be a little bit brighter. So that end color, I might just boost the brightness on that a little bit. And then the start color, I could push that all the way up to 100% brightness. Then I might grab my sky darkener layer and just adjust that curve a little bit more. I'm gonna pull the black input in a little bit, which is gonna kind of bring out some saturation and darken that sky a little bit more. And I don't wanna go too crazy, but I do want that to pop a little bit more than it was. And now that I've done that, I feel like I need to adjust the mask so that it becomes a little bit less noticeable down here near the tree. Then I can just do a little bit of an overall grade. So I'll add one more adjustment layer, and I'll just call this one grade. And on this one, I'm gonna put a color correction levels effect. I'm gonna leave the blacks where they are. If you notice, these trees are really, really dark, but they're not actually black, and I kinda like that. But I am gonna push the white output down just a little bit more. And you can see what a subtle little difference that makes. But it does make the type a little bit more readable. And maybe on this adjustment layer, what I could do is mask it so that the center of this sign is actually not affected by it. So I just made a mask. By default, it's in add mode. If I set that to subtract and then feather it, now you'll notice that the center of that sign is not darkened with the rest of the footage. And I always like to add subtle little details to kind of finish things. And so what I think might be cool is to duplicate this MoGraph Meetup layer. Let's call this glow. And let's add a subtle glow to this because the sign is glowing. It's got neon on it, and so I think it's appropriate. I'm gonna add a Gaussian blur, and I'm gonna crank that up until I start to see a little bit of bloom here. I'm then gonna set the transfer mode to add. I'm gonna make sure that repeat edge pixels is off, otherwise you get that weird hard edge. And then I'm gonna turn the opacity all the way to 0 and slowly bring it up until I just feel a little bit of glow on it. And then I might blur it out a little bit more so you start to see a little bit of a halo. And if I turn that layer on and off, you can see what it's doing. I feel like even that's a little bit much. I might bring the opacity down, maybe 10%. I just want a little bit of a glow there. And voila, there is the title shot. Now there's a lot of little details. We could make the masks cleaner. We could probably even do a little bit more with the type if we wanted to, but I wanted to show you in this tutorial how you can follow some simple rules and just use some really simple tools in After Effects to get something pretty cool, something that is different than what you'd get if you're using a template. If you're an editor being asked to do things like this, and you can think a little bit like a designer and use some of these tools, you can really add so much to your projects. So that is it for this video and the series. I really hope you learned something. And if you want to learn After Effects, and I mean really learn it, check out After Effects for Editors. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.